Thank you, Frank. I appreciate very much that introduction, and I'm trying not to think of it as a fancy way of saying, this lady is really old. I was absolutely delighted when Lee Shore asked me to keynote this conference, and I was even more enthusiastic when I discovered who the Friends of Evidence were. I hadn't discovered them before, what they were thinking and saying, and what they had in mind for this conference. Now, as Frank noted, I've spent a long time thinking and writing about evidence and social policy at various times in a long career. I wrote a book, the book he quoted from actually, called Systematic Thinking for Social Action in 1971. That was based on my experience at the then Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Few of you will remember that, but it included not only all of current HHS, but education and Social Security. It was a very big department indeed. And I was the assistant secretary, the second one actually, for planning and evaluation. Evaluation was a radical new idea then, especially systematic evaluation of social policy. Evaluation was mostly associated with cost-benefit studies of infrastructure projects, canals and dams and that sort of thing. Were they worth building? And a little bit with the military, because you will remember it was Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, who brought systematic thinking first to the Pentagon, and then when Johnson got enamored of what was happening, to the rest of the government. So evaluation was somehow associated in the minds of social reformers with things like body counts in the Vietnam War. So we evaluators were pioneers in a social service agency, and we were pretty threatening to the practitioners, especially to the social reformers. I had to fight to get the OMB director to restore the money for the 1969 to the 1969 budget for the income maintenance experiments. He'd taken it out, and I thought, oh boy, I know him. I better call him. I thought I was very brave. I was a very young assistant secretary, and I picked up the phone and called the OMB director, who had been on my thesis committee when I was in graduate school, fortunately, and he said, oh, I didn't know you wanted it. We'll put it back. Easiest phone call I ever made. So I learned a lot in that job, and I wrote a lot of stuff about plan variation and social experiments. I kept coming back to the evolving story of evidence and evaluation at the CBO, at the OMB, even, believe it or not, at the Federal Reserve, where we had to implement the GPRA, the Government Results and Performance Act. And I'm back at it again at the Brookings Institution, where I'm working on how we evaluate the long-term effects of implementing the Affordable Care Act. So this invitation from Lee was like going home. It was a chance to reconnect with Lee and with people like her. And I was right. This is a wonderful group of people, as Frank just said. Serious, dedicated, evidence-minded progressives. Now, evidence-minded progressives feel strongly that our country is not living up to its potential as a land of opportunity, that many people, because they're poor or people of color, never have a chance for a good life, that the tragedy of poverty and segregation is especially damaging for children, especially very young children who have limited chances to develop their potential. But these people, the evidence-minded progressives, also believe that something can be done, that social change is possible, that some combination of public policy and private initiative can improve the life chances of these children and their families and make America a more just and fair and productive and less unequal society. But they also believe that making and implementing effective social policy is very hard work, that we have to keep trying things to see how they work, keep learning from our mistakes until we get it right, and we may never get it right. We have to generate evidence, solid, convincing evidence that interventions are working, and then keep trying to make them better. So this conference was in my comfort zone, my kind of folks. And the more that I found out about what the Friends of Evidence were saying, the more I realized they were singing my song. I particularly resonated to several themes that I found in the background documents. One is inclusiveness, the idea that evidence comes in many shapes and sizes and from many sources, and that restricting evidence to single methods and single measures is likely to be narrowing and distorting and even misleading. And the Friends of Evidence believe in rigor. They also believe in not overdoing it. They believe in learning from implementation on the ground in real communities and over time. And most important, they believe in instilling a culture of continuous feedback and learning from doing. That's great stuff, and I'll come back to it. But I also realized a little over a week ago that this comfort zone was too comfortable. It felt like a pleasant island in a raging sea. A little over a week ago, we had an election, in case you hadn't noticed. And it was not just one more election that happened to be a good night for Republicans. I think it should be a wake-up call for evidence-based progressives. We're losing. We are not convincing the voting public that social policy can make a positive difference. Now, it's very easy to dismiss this election as having little substantive significance. And many of the pundits have. It was a midterm election. That's always bad for incumbents. Obama is a second-term president. They always have trouble. The president is unpopular because he's too stiff or professorial, or midterm voters tend to be racist. The senators who lost were Democrats in Republican states. Not to worry. Nothing fundamental is happening. Wait a minute. I think something fundamental is happening. It didn't start with this election, but the election is dramatic evidence. That's evidence, folks. There was a conservative sweep, not just in red states or congressional districts. There were purple ones, too. Mark Udall going down in Colorado, Kay Hagan going down in North Carolina, in blue states, like Maryland electing a Republican governor that nobody expected, Mark Warner coming close in Virginia. The president who had achieved what Truman, Carter, and Clinton could not, affordable health care for just about everybody, so vilified for Obamacare that Democratic candidates couldn't even talk about it. That's serious stuff. My son was working as a campaign chairman for a Democratic candidate in Kentucky who lost, and he reported that although the Kentucky version of Obamacare is wildly popular, it's called Connect, K-Y, and it has very high approval ratings in the congressional district that he was working in. His candidate couldn't mention it. Couldn't mention Obamacare, couldn't even mention Connect, because the polls said, don't do it, stay away from it, don't talk about anything that has to do with President Obama. There's a message here, there's evidence. Anti-government rhetoric has always been a crowd pleaser. But sorry, this is a venomous new high in anti-government sentiment. 53% of the public say they want less government. Huge majorities think the Congress is on the wrong track and blame the president. A lot of people think that government action makes things worse rather than better. They don't believe that the social interventions that the progressives favor are doing good, and they don't want to hear about how to use evidence to improve the effectiveness of programs that they think we shouldn't be doing at all. Now, these voters aren't mean, they aren't stupid. They believe that the intervention we think might improve people's lives is a form of arrogant meddling that is likely to do more harm than good, that if we stop trying to help people, they will be stronger, and that they will make their way better on their own. These aren't new ideas, and they aren't all wrong. But I see progressives, even evidence-based progressives, mostly hunkering down rather than engaging. Blame the Koch brothers, blame racism, blame something, but don't try to engage with these ideas. So I want to do two things this morning. First, as Frank said, I want to talk about the trajectory of thinking about evidence on social programs as seen from the vantage point of policymakers in Washington, and one person who has interacted with them over, as Frank pointed out, a long time. And the other is to come back at the end to the worrying question of why we might win the battle of evidence and lose the war for better policy if we don't wake up. Now, HEW in the 1960s, the late 1960s when I was there, was a wonderful place to be. Our job in this newly created Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation was to find evidence about how the new programs passed in the explosion of legislation in 1964-65 were working. And we were not welcomed by those trying hard to implement those programs. They didn't have time. They wanted to get on with the job of doing it, and we wanted to study it. Both the advocates and the evaluators seem quite naive by today's standards. There was Head Start. We were going to change the lives of children permanently by putting them in a program for part of a year when they were 4, or maybe it was 5. And there was Title I, there was the Job Corps. We believed, or many people believed, that simple interventions could change lives, and the evaluators believed that we could find results. It gradually dawned on all of us that the world was more complicated, that Head Start gains faded, that we needed to maintain the momentum to do other things as those children grew. There was the follow-through program. There were programs that started earlier. It was important to have a full-day program, to start before 4 or 5, to start at 3 or 2 or 1, and now we're back to 0. I think we're back to minus several years. We realized that we had to focus on health as well as cognitive development, that we had to focus on parents and get teenagers working with kids, that it would be good to involve seniors as foster grandparents. At the beginning, the advocates were pretty suspicious of the evaluation, and they were often hostile because, as I said, we wanted to study things, and they wanted to do them. But both the advocates and the evaluators got more experienced and less naive. Both learned and came to appreciate the other. The meticulous experiments were designed in this period. The fabulous work under the radar of MDRC, which has changed a lot of thinking, began then. And we tried large experiments, even whole communities. I was a huge enthusiast at the beginning of the income maintenance experiments and the health insurance experiment. We learned a lot from them, both substantively and methodologically. But I and others came to realize their limitations, that it's especially hard to use temporary, isolated interventions, even in several cities, to predict the effects of permanent universal programs. Personally, I think my biggest epiphany in those years was the realization, trite as it may sound, that this is a huge, diverse country with many different local cultures and a strong desire for individual and community autonomy. Washington does some things well. The thing it does best is writing checks. But I came to realize in those years that it was next to impossible to sit in Washington and write regulations that would make sense in thousands of local communities or school districts or whatever we were dealing with, and not arouse resentment. My epiphanies came mostly around Title I of the Education Act. I remember going to a school right here in Washington, because I thought I should go see what was happening on the ground, a Title I elementary school. And I sat for a long time in the outer office of the principal, who was alone that day. She had no assistant. She was dealing with all kinds of emergencies, a parent arrested, a child sick, whatever was happening. And after a while, she turned wearily to this eager young bureaucrat who wanted to ask about the Title I program. And she didn't immediately recollect what it was, but then she said, oh, yes. They came and gave us some audiovisual equipment. It's over there in the closet. Nobody here knows how to use it. That made me realize implementation is everything. My friend Donna Shalala had her epiphany in Alaska. She had a similar job to mine at HUD, and she was there looking at newly constructed housing and realizing that these regulations written in Washington didn't work on the tundra. The building was sinking into the permafrost, and something different had to be done. The confluence of the civil rights movement and the war on poverty was a very good thing. It made poverty a matter of social justice. It was an enormous positive there was an enormous positive reinforcement between the civil rights movement and the war on poverty. But I think there is also an unfortunate legacy. Two. One was the identification of poverty with race. The other was the impression that the federal government was always where the action was. The progressive movement that started back in 1910 didn't start that way. It started at the state level. But the new progressivism, starting in the 60s, was started along with the civil rights movement as a Washington-centered thing, pitting the feds against the states, especially but not exclusively in the South. The huge change that I think has happened since then and has gradually, but too gradually, permeated the world of social reform is that many states have become the laboratories of democracy, as Brandeis thought they were, and progressives have refocused on communities and place-based initiatives. But the residue remains. I recently served on along with Angela Blackwell, and maybe others in this room, but on a wonderful commission financed by the Robert Wood Johnson Commission on a healthier America. And some of us on the commission had to resist the constant emphasis on what can the federal government do? Well, the answer is not very much. If we're going to have a healthier America, it's because schools and communities and recreation departments and so forth get the message that we have to rethink our whole approach to health. Health doesn't have a lot to do with health care. It has to do with exercise and nutrition and other things, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The Affordable Care Act, which I dearly hope is successful and believe will be, may actually be the last big federal social program. It patches the hole that was there. We didn't decide to do a national health system. We decided to do it in pieces: Medicare, Medicaid, reliance on employers, the Children's Health Program, and there was this one big hole of the people who weren't eligible for anything else and didn't get health care through their employer that had to be patched. So it was federal legislation, and it had to be. But the Affordable Care Act will play out in the states and will be greatly shaped, and already is, by local politics and local culture. And that affects how it will be evaluated. It will take painstaking effort to understand the situation on the ground in order to create a culture of continuous learning around this new piece of legislation. You can't do that by collecting national statistics. You can't understand, for example, why the exchange in New York worked very well and the one in Massachusetts was a total failure when you might have predicted the opposite. You have to go and talk to people and see what happened and learn on the ground. And the experience of evaluating the act is going to be a tightrope. Somewhere between anecdote and national analysis lies a ground in which we can actually learn something. The Congressional Budget Office, which I want to mention only briefly, was the place where I think I came to grips with what evidence Congress needs most closely. The CBO has to face up to what evidence do we have that this program will work, and what evidence do we have on what it will cost and or what it will save the government? That's a hard job. And as I go around now, I see two things. One is the search for evidence is pervasive, and Congress does almost nothing without at least having the CBO report. The other is that the CBO is vilified on both sides because conservatives say it doesn't give enough credit to the beneficial impact of tax cuts, and liberals say it doesn't give enough credit to the beneficial impact of social policy. Being caught in the middle is a very interesting thing, but at least they're there. Fast forward to this enormously exciting present. We know a lot more than we did about early childhood development, about how young brains react to stress and violence, We know more about how adolescents develop, a lot more about effective teaching and learning. We've discovered that children are different, that they learn in different ways, that we aren't going to discover some magic formula. We talk about blended learning. The health policy community has moved there too. We're realizing that good health is not just about healthcare, it's mostly about human behavior. But that it intersects very strongly with questions of poverty and race and place. You can't tell people to exercise if it's not safe to walk out the front door. You can't tell people to eat vegetables if there's no place to buy them and they're not used to cooking or eating healthy food. You can't control asthma in the emergency room if you're sending the child back to a home full of mold and dust. Evidence-minded progressives have become more eclectic too and realize that there are varieties of evidence and that there are dangers of distorting behavior or even of cheating on the part of well-meaning implementers when we rely too heavily on a single measure like test scores or a single method like controlled trials. The fact that this meeting is happening, that serious interaction is taking place among scholars of different disciplines on how we best collect evidence is enormously reassuring. The biggest breakthrough in recent years, I think, is the growing realization that people have to work together. Duh. Especially so-called experts have to work together. Teachers and parents, health planners and community planners, schools and neighborhoods. I'm terribly tired of the buzzwords, interdisciplinary, silos, stovepipes. I grew up in the Middle West, so I know what a silo is. And my grandmother had a wood stove, so I've seen a stovepipe. Most of the people who use these terms have never seen either. And the other thing is that the ratio of talk is too high. Interdisciplinary experts talking to each other means endless meetings, endless dinners. It's very hard to do. Not very many years ago in this very city, I got the school superintendent and the director of planning into the same room and discovered to my surprise and theirs that they had never met. It's hard, but some of it's happening. And I'm an optimist, and I see lots of encouraging, exciting work going on within the world represented here, most of it at the community level, centered on concepts of continuous feedback and culture of learning. Left to ourselves, the group in this room could change the world. We would work in neighborhoods and schools, we would promote change, we would get professionals in different disciplines working together, we would develop eclectic but rigorous evaluation designs, we would learn from them. But then there's the world outside our comfort zone. There are people who don't believe in what you and I are trying to do. It's a very polarized world and it's becoming more and more separate. So what do we do about it? I don't know, but I do know that we have to engage with the ideas of the people who don't believe in what we are doing. We have to admit that not everything that progressives have favored over the years has worked. We've got to get out of the stereotypes. We've got to admit that rich people aren't all evil and poor people aren't all good, hardworking, upstanding citizens. We have to work at the state and the local and the community level where problem solving and compromise are more evidently necessary than they are in Washington. I don't have answers to this, but I believe strongly that we can't just talk to ourselves or we will be isolated and ineffective. Thank you.
I can't imagine a more provocative way to start the day and a wonderful swath of thought and history. We have time for questions, and let me see if folks have questions, comments, reflections. Anyone? Yes, sir.
Good morning. I'm Marty Blank with the Institute for Education and Leadership. Since you've worked on the social policy side, on the economic policy side in your... I'm Marty Blank with the Institute for Education and Leadership. Dr. Rivlin, since you've worked on the social policy side and the economic policy side, can you talk a little bit about that interaction? In today's environment, some of the families that all of us care about are facing enormous stress. The workplace has become much more difficult for them, much more unscheduled. So all of those forces clearly impinge on what we're trying to do on the social policy side. Can you talk about how we should be, a little bit about how we might think about that intersection?
Yes, I think that's a very good question, and obviously a good economy helps everything. If you go back to the 1990s, when I was at the Federal Reserve, we were worrying about the fact that unemployment dipped below 4% and might set off inflation, except it didn't. At about the same time, we had the Welfare Reform Act, on which progressives were very divided, but we never could have gotten through that period of the Welfare Reform Act without a very good economy. And I think what we learned, the big benefit of having very low unemployment is people can get jobs. But much better than that, employers are reluctant to let them go. They want to train them. They want to hold on to them. They want to move them up the ladder because they can't find anybody else. That is a situation that we should be trying very hard to return to. Now, I believe that we did mostly the right things in the face of this great recession that never should have happened. We did the wrong things before, but once it happened, once we were faced with this cataclysmic drop in employment and income, I think the government reacted quite well. The Fed did what it could, brought interest rates down, began buying bonds. That helped. The stimulus package was probably not big enough, but it was a big help. And one of the problems of evidence that you're all familiar with, but particularly on the macro level, is nobody believes the counterfactual. Nobody says nobody believes that if we had not done the stimulus package, things would have been an awful lot worse. The counter argument is always, you did the stimulus, but we still got 6% unemployment. Nothing works. Nonsense. You know that. These are coordinate things. We have to work as hard as we possibly can to get back to full employment, to grow the economy, particularly to raise wages at the bottom because they've been lagging, and all of that makes social policy more feasible.
Yes.
One of the interesting things over the last 5 years is the engagement in the business community with concerns about the future workforce. And I wondered your thoughts about our progressive evidence, also a community very involved in thinking about innovation. And I wondered how we could use this group and frames of evidence to better ally with our business communities at a local level.
That bears thinking about, but there should be a natural alliance. And I think the natural alliance will be most evident at the local level. where specific employers care deeply about the workforce and its the education of the workforce and their ability to find people who can do the jobs they need done, and harness their energies toward doing some of the things that people, that the social policy people want to do. Evidence should not be a hard sell in the business community. Neither should continuous improvement. That's where these ideas came from the quality revolution in business. It shouldn't be a hard sell for the Friends of Evidence to say, come on in and help us think about this. It's a problem not very different from the ones you face in evaluating how you do, how your company is doing its job.
One more question before we have the next speaker. Kathleen.
Hi, Kathleen Noonan, Children's Hospital, Philadelphia. Can I ask you, how much do you think we should use the children's poverty level as some kind of indicator of how well we're doing? I was really struck that in New York City, between 2002 and 2012, that the child poverty rate increased from like a low of 25% in 2002 and is creeping back up now into 30%, 31%, at a time when New York City, at least, you know, since I had lived, it was wealthier than it had ever been. So should we be using that as a marker of our success?
Well, I think that's two questions, really. Should we be concerned that more children are growing up in families with low income? And yes, clearly we should be. But then there's the measurement question. Are we measuring it right? I knew Molly Orshansky. She made up those numbers, made up the federal poverty line, and it was a useful tool, but the conservatives are actually right. They keep saying, but the poverty line doesn't count the value of social services and food stamps and so forth. They're right about that. The resistance of progressives to making a more inclusive definition of the poverty line, I think, is wrong-headed, because it shows that we are making, if you do that, it shows we are making progress. And how could we not be? We've spent an awful lot on food stamps and on child health programs and what have you, and that ought to count for something. It doesn't deny the fact, though, that the wages and the incomes in the lower two-thirds of the income distribution, but particularly at the bottom, have lagged terribly, and that's a real problem. So I'm saying, yes, we should be concerned. We should measure it right, but we got a long way to go.
Terrific. Alice, thank you. Please join me in thanking Alice again for a really, really terrific